Hi everyone. Welcome all to the fourth webinar being organized by Metro Academy and Medinit. We have many people join from different continents. Good number of people join from different continents. And I would like to thank Indus Pharma being the supporting partner for this educational event. And today's webinar is on time-lapse technology, knowing the system, the language of embryology, and the TL clinic workflow. Time-lapse is writing a new chapter in the field of IVF with the language of embryology getting refined with the newer annotations emerging from laboratories worldwide. We all know that there remains some debate regarding the usefulness of TL systems in IVF labs. Let us hear from the highly experienced IVF laboratory scientists and innovators of a TL system on the basics, its usefulness, and what the future holds. We are really honored to have a distinguished group of experts in the field of TL technology, and it is my honor to introduce you to the moderator of the webinar and the first speaker, Dr. Walid Malouf. Walid is the course director and the lecturer in Masters of Medical Science of Assisted Reproduction at the University of Nottingham, UK. And also he holds the position of postgraduate teaching director in this division of Obs-Gynae at the University of Nottingham. Currently, he is leading a number of research projects focusing on the effect of micromanipulation techniques that is usually done in the ART field. And also he's having a lot of collaborative work that is focusing on the safety aspects of assisted reproductive technology. With that, I would like to hand over the session to our moderator of the day, Walid Malouf.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex, and thank you everybody who got involved in organizing this event. It's an honor to be here today. I will start by introducing the time-lapse technology and hand over for the different speakers. We have a very nice panel of speakers this morning. A disclaimer, I'm an embryoscope trainer as well. On standard embryo assessment, how it all started. So standard embryology assessment typically involves daily checks of the embryo development by taking the dishes in and out of the incubator into the laminar flow hood, which has an integrated microscope, a heated stage. And this movement of embryos taking them out of their safe incubation environment usually have to be minimal because that can create stress for the embryos. So that type of stress, there are different factors, that stress the embryo with those motions and activities, including temperature shifts, changes from 37 to room temperature and back to 37 multiple times. You've got the change in the CO2 percentage causing pH changes. You've got exposure to volatile organic compounds, light, and then obviously you've got the handling risk that comes with potential drop mix-ups, dropping the dishes, and sort of increase sort of movements in the laboratory as well. This all led to the development of what you call the time-lapse technology systems, and typically the ones that are used today are integrated system. The system include the incubator, it includes the microscope, the camera, include as well the computer and a sort of suitable software to run everything together and allow a suitable interface with the operator. And typically as well, they have a system that has a very clean air environment. All of this lead to what you see on the left-hand side video is it's a time-lapse video created on one of those time-lapse systems over 5 days of development. Why do we use time-lapse in IVF and what do you get? There are a number of reasons clinics choose using the time-lapse system, and ultimately it is to improve clinical outcome for patients, but as well they can have additional benefits to the embryology lab and the clinic overall as well. In this presentation, we'll cover mainly the top 4 reasons why people are using time-lapse. So solving the observational dilemma is, with time-lapse, we are moving from what you call a single point observations on a daily basis to continuous observations. And this leads to better selection at the same time without disturbing the embryo, leading to less stress, and as well by controlling, having a better environment control around the embryos that are developing. So this illustrates the same thing. It's a better illustration showing on top like how you have what you call standard evaluation, taking the embryos on a daily basis for single checks on development. And at the bottom, you have a series of time-lapse images that can be run as a video for evaluation anytime during or after the treatment. One of the major benefits with time-lapse is that you can, for the first time, can culture and monitor your embryos in an undisturbed environment. Handling of embryos outside the incubator is well known to stress the embryos, as we demonstrated that, and can have effects on their viability. So you have less handling, you've got embryos in a stable environment, better development, and as well as, unlike what some people say, you have actually less light exposure to standard evaluation. The standardized evaluation, embryo scoring is very dependent on who is scoring, that it is a potential issue, this subjectivity. And with time-lapse, you can be more standardized, more consistent, and you can be less depending on the subjective assessment. By this, you have less inter-operator dependence, which can be lowered, and the variability in the evaluation can be reduced. And then in the long run, that can as well improve your clinical outcome. As you know, morphology is dynamic. It changes over time. It means the observation made is very much dependent on the timing that you actually take the dishes out of the incubator and observe them in standard embryology. And this is important because now we know, for example, when you're assessing Z-score, for example, of the pronuclear precursor bodies, they can rearrange over time. Fragmentation are very time dependent. And as well in the blastocyst, for example, it's very dynamic, it can pulsate, and then it is important to observe it at the time of optimal expansion level, not when it's collapsing. Otherwise, it can be excluded from treatment. So this is on morphology, dynamic morphology. You have cleavage patterns, so you can observe things like abnormal patterns such as asymmetry, direct cleavage or reverse cleavage, and other as well events. And more importantly, morphokinetics, which is highly sort of cited with time-lapse systems in terms of timing of developmental events and timing of those morphology events and how they are all sort of the timing and the relationship between those specific events. So what is important in time-lapse is to turn these observations of variables into mark them. And this is what we call annotations. Annotation of variables is where you mark this timing of development or observation that you make into a digital timestamp. And this can be used later to make decision on this particular embryo in the treatment. This is an example of some of the common variables that are used in early development and their, sort of the time points when they reach. And these milestones of development, then you can look at the relationship between the time points and look at the cell cycle, the synchronicity. And then you can assess, how fast, how slow, and the normal pattern of development of these embryos all the way to the blastocyst stage. There's nothing that can be missed with time-lapse. You can observe anything that is intracytoplasmic, extracytoplasmic, morphokinetic parameters. And, with the latest ESHRE recommendation for TLT, they list, all markers that you can observe, usually either exclusively observed in time-lapse or better observed in time-lapse technology. What we do with these variables, typically we correlate them with implantation and live birth. And then that allows to have a clinic-specific or universal algorithm or models for embryo selection and deselection. So this is the typical correct use of the instrument. This is my final slide of the presentation for my 10 minutes. Although markers of embryo development are better and exclusively observed by time-lapse and been correlated strongly with implantation and live birth outcome for many of those parameters, It is still regulators and in different places remain cautious about recommending time-lapse technology. This can likely change, and this is usually done by better education and training and best practice of use of this system. And on this note, I look forward to listen to the next set of presentation about time-lapse so we can have a better view on how the technology is used currently. It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Niels Ramsing. He is the Director of Strategic Product Development at Vitrolife, previously Chief Scientific Officer at Unisense Fertility Tech, Associate Professor, and he studied a PhD in microbial ecology and worked in Germany and the United States. And he's known to invent the first EmbryoScope time-lapse system, which was commercially launched in 2009 for clinical use. On that note, over to you, Niels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Walid. It's indeed a great honor to be able to present data here today. I'm really excited. And I'd like to also thank all the listeners for being here and hearing the status of time-lapse today. Now, if I can switch to my presentation, I hope, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think it was an excellent introduction, Walid. So I don't need to talk very much about what time-lapse systems is. What I will do instead is to talk a little bit about time-lapse from Vitrolife. So these are the EmbryoScope systems. And clearly I'm a Vitrolife employee and I've been working with this for 15 years. So I'm very much partial to this particular technology and you should be aware of that. So first of all, I would like to say that the incubator is only part of the system. At Vitrolife, we have 3 different types of incubators, the EmbryoScope Plus, the EmbryoScope Flex, and the EmbryoScope 8. And these are suited for different types of clinics and different types of practices. But in order to work with them, of course, you need to have the disposables, the culture dishes that goes with these instruments, and you need to have the software to afterwards record, to take the images and evaluate the images and find out which embryo to pick. And this requires what we call the embryo viewer software. All the data has to be on a server, and this server has to be safe and protected. And that's what we call our ES server and the ES Server Plus. And then finally, looking through all these images yourself is quite a cumbersome task. So you need to have some automated software, preferably with with artificial intelligence, to try to help you guide through the annotation and the selection process for these images. And these tools have been developing very, very much during the last couple of years. And I think they've improved to make the whole job of evaluating the time-lapse data that we have much more efficient and much more accurate than what we did before. And I would like very much to show you a little bit about that. But first, let's get back to the instruments. And of course, if the instrument doesn't work, you will not have any embryos coming out of the treatment. And that's not good. So for that reason, all the EmbryoScopes that are produced by Vitrolife are tested individually with mouse embryo assays before they're released. And I think this tradition of mouse embryo assays are very strong in Vitrolife. And I think it's really important because you could have things happening. What's other particular things about our instruments is that we have an air circulation system. In fact, the air inside the incubation chamber is circulated through a HEPA filter and a VOC filter every 20 minutes or even down to 10 minutes. And that means that the air is constantly purified. And this means that you actually get a lot of the properties that you'd have from a normal small chamber incubator, even though the instrument itself is a bit larger. And that's very low consumption of gases, which can be expensive. So we are using 0.3 liters of CO2 typically, and less than 2 liters of nitrogen typically for one of these instruments. And to put that into comparison, if you take an ordinary CO2 canister from a SodaStream device, it can actually give CO2 enough for a full month of operation of one of our incubators. Obviously, if you want to do reduced oxygen, you also have to have nitrogen gas, and that then takes a bit more consumption. But it's actually quite economical in this way. It also means for very rapid recovery every time you open. And part of the construction is that you don't open only a gateway into the chamber. And this is very efficient in making sure that the other embryos inside are not disturbed whenever you open or close it, and also that the amount of gas that's being exchanged is as small as possible. Further sort of normal handling things is to have registration of the patients. And this we've done with 2D barcodes. And these barcodes are being printed from the embryo viewer station, and then they are put onto the culture dish. And these are then automatically read, which is quite nice because it makes sure that the instrument automatically can recognize a patient and store the data belonging to a particular patient with other data from that patient. And that makes the whole handling of patients a lot more flexible and easy in the day-to-day cycles. So, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so there are certain features of this system that they have in common. They have in common that they are very compact instruments, so they can handle between 15 and 25 patients, depending on which model we're looking at. If you go for 15 patients, there's room for 16 embryos for each patient. If you go for 25 patients, there's only room for 6 embryos, which is quite useful in low stimulation situations. We have a very small discrete loading area. I talked about that. I talked about the recycled air. What I also think is quite important is that we have direct heat transfer. And this direct heat transfer is because we have a 2-layer temperature control system. And that system is especially important if you have temperature fluctuations in your laboratory environment. Even temperature changes as much as 10 degrees will not influence the inside chamber temperature where the embryo sits. And this is very important because dial fluctuations in laboratory conditions are known to occur in some clinics. I would also like to talk a little bit about the culture dish. In the culture dish for the ES Plus, as I said, we have room for 16 individually labeled culture wells. And they're put in a format that makes it quite sure that you don't confuse them. And to enable that, there's also some micro numerals that have numbers on each of the small wells. And these are so small that you will see them when you handle the embryos, and makes it very important that you look at the right embryo and it's the right embryo that you transfer. It also has a shared media reservoir, and this is very important for media change because, as you can see, there's a little inlet where the media can be pipetted out if you want to remove old media, and where you can add new media. So this facilitates media handling. There's another effect of it which I would like to point out, and that is that we have the media itself in a small depression under oil cover. And this minimizes the oil to media interface. And this is important because it protects the embryo from evaporation. In fact, this dish itself has especially designed to make sure that even though we do not have a humidified environment, we don't have so much loss of media that it creates any osmotic problems. And we have evaluated this on numerous occasions and in many experiments, both with weight loss and with osmometer readings. And we can safely say that the amount of evaporation is less than 1% per day. And that means that if we look at mouse embryo assays, we have, for instance, a starting point at 270 milliosmol for our GTL medium. And in a humidified embryo, this increases to 275. In the embryoscope, it will increase a bit more to 286, but this is still much less than having any detrimental effect on the embryo. In fact, there's a lot of media, commercial media, that are sold with starting osmolalities above 290 milliosmol. This has been validated by cell counts of the embryo, and it's been validated with blastocyst rates, expansion rates, and hatching rates for mouse embryos, and numerous studies also with human embryos. So I believe we have a very safe and very efficient system for embryo development, which also has been shown in several comparative studies. So that's culturing the embryos. Now, how do you then use the information you get from time-lapse to actually select embryos? And that's where it's important to have guided annotation for a streamlined annotation, and to be able to compare the top choices of embryos for selection. So this is, in our current system, done in a 2-step process. First, the annotation is done, which is aided by artificial intelligence. And then in a second step, the parameters that are derived from the morphokinetic parameters, they're put into an algorithm to predict what is the likelihood of implantation for the particular embryos. And I'll go through that process very quickly. So the first step is the guided annotation. And that's where the artificial intelligence analyzes the images and try to determine when did different events occur. And these are cell division events, but these are also the number of pronuclei, and they're also an assessment of the quality of the blastocyst. So it's the inner cell mass and it's the trophectoderm quality according to the Gardner score. Now, the computer algorithm tries to determine its best estimate, but it also tries to find out how sure it is about this estimate. And this is quite a crucial point, because sometimes the computer is rather confused. And it gives then a score, a threshold for the confidence level. And the user can set this threshold for the confidence level so that if you're very busy in a clinic, you can say, well, I believe the computer if it's 70% or higher confident in its set. Or I can say, well, I actually have a lot of time today, so I'd set the threshold a bit lower, a bit higher at 90%. And what this means is that cell division timings, for instance, where the computer is more than 90% sure, these you can pass in your subsequent validation step. If you set a threshold of 70%, then everything where it's more than 70% sure, you can pass very easily in the annotation step. You can always go back and validate what the computer does, but the mandatory validation can be reduced in this way. So what we believe is that this is a very efficient and a very flexible way, which still makes sure that the embryologist is in control and actually makes the ultimate embryo assessment of these very important morphokinetic parameters. Now you have your morphokinetic parameters. What then to do with them? Well, what has been popular from the very onset was to try to do morphokinetic models. And these are models that are supposed to grade the embryos according to the likelihood of subsequent implantation and ultimately live birth. It's important that when you create such models, they're based on large sets of embryos, because there are differences between clinics, and it can be dangerous to apply models just non-discriminatory across clinics and across different practices. So what we have, fortunately, is a very large database with known outcome for more than 15,000 embryos. And based on this model, we've been able to construct a set of models which we call KIT score. There's a KIT score on day 3, which is used to evaluate likelihood of implantation on day 3, and a KIT score day 5 for blastocyst culture, which is used to evaluate likelihood of implantation on day 5. Now, these models simply based on your selected parameters, this is a viewer picture, where you can choose what type of model to use. And in this case, the model of KIT score day 5 has been used. And this then assign a current score to each of the embryos. In this case, there are 12 embryos. And you can see that the highest scoring embryo has an embryo score of 9.1. There's one which is a close runner-up at 8.4. And probably one of these two should be chosen for transfer. There's some other ones with decent scores of 4.9 or 6.7, and these could probably be used for transfer. So this is a very quick overview to get a recommendation about which embryos to look further into to transfer. Now, does it work? Well, that's a very good question. And this is a slide from a recent presentation. In fact, it was a presentation here at ESHRE this year, last Tuesday, by Lorena Bori. And what she looked at was a case of almost 2,000 embryos with known implantation data. And these have not been used in any of the models before. And they were divided in roughly 4 different categories of same size, about 500 embryos each. And the one with the lowest KIT scores had the lowest implantation rates. They also had the lowest live birth rate, whereas the ones with the highest had the highest birth rates and also the highest implantation rates. And these differences were clearly significant. They also looked about employed, euploid, and aneuploid embryos. And this was quite interesting because this is also a rather large data set, again, around 2,000 embryos in 4 equal groups. And what this shows is with very low KIT score data, the euploid rate was down to 34%. And with very high, above 6.5, the euploid rate was 58%. Now, this does not mean that you can use time-lapse to select euploid embryos, but it does mean that if you really use time-lapse, you have a higher probability of selecting a euploid embryo if you use embryos from the best categories based on morphokinetic parameters. It's not a substitute for PGT, but if you don't do PGT, I think it's a very efficient way to still pick the best embryo. But then if you do PGT and you want to use time-lapse as a supplement, well, in case you have more than one euploid embryo, then you could actually choose based on the KIT score data, which euploid embryo to transfer. And this is a presentation, an oral presentation from last year's ESHRE, where Lim looked at data from poor, fair, or good embryos, all graded with KIT score. And what they found was for the good embryos, and these were all euploid embryos, they had a significantly higher implantation rate than the poor embryos. Not all these differences were significant, but the differences between good and poor were truly significant. So I think that even if you do PGT, using time-lapse to further select the embryo, if you have more than one euploid embryo with the highest implantation likelihood, is possible. Still, I think with all these decision support tools, it's still important that the embryologist remained in charge. And that's where it's important to be able to compare the full cohort of embryos that are available for a particular treatment cycle. And these includes, of course, maybe different cultivation dishes, but also embryos that have previously been frozen. And many of our customers have requested this, and I'm really happy to say that this is now part of the system. You can also look up the frozen embryos belonging to the same patient to try to see if maybe some of the embryos we have in the freezer are better than the ones we have from the current fresh cycle. And to really look at this, it's also important that you can look at these side by side. This is a case where they're really nice blastocysts, and according to the model, the scores don't differ very much between 8.4 and 9.3. So there I think it's a very good thing that the embryologist is able to look at these embryos once again and make his or her own decision on these matters. Finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the future, because what we've been talking about so far in terms of using the time-lapse data is a two-step process. First, doing the annotation, finding the morphokinetic parameters, and afterwards applying a model to find out which ones are most likely to implant. Why not do the whole thing in one step? And indeed, such direct analysis using artificial intelligence has been around for a couple of years, and we've been working very hard to bring this to the market in a very simple and very easy to use fashion. So the advantage here is that you have an instant automated evaluation, which gives consistent predictions, and there's no manual annotations involved. And this will indeed be an integral part of all new Vitrolife time-lapse systems. And because that you don't have these middle points where you can actually yourself validate whether the algorithm is doing the right thing, it's very important that it's trained on a very large data set. And we have a data set of more than 115,000 embryos that we've used for this training. It uses the full time-lapse sequence and even the different focal planes that are acquired at the full time-lapse sequence. And at the moment, we are in ongoing RCTs to validate this method before we bring it to the market, but it will be on the market in the early next year. And we call it IDA score, and I cannot wait to show you the data on this particular thing, but at the moment, it's still under embargo at Vitrolife. So to finish up, I say that we have been in the time-lapse business for quite a while, so we have a lot of experience, we have a lot of knowledge about this, and we have very complete time-lapse systems. And at the moment, we're doing a lot of work to improve these systems using artificial intelligence, and we have a group just dedicated to that, and we have an even larger group dedicated to implementing this in software. And I think this will actually be the second wave of time-lapse once these new techniques become common usage. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Niels. I just want to say that we'll be taking questions at the end. And
okay. Well, thank you. That was my presentation.
thank you very much, Niels. Okay, I would like to introduce, we're going to be moving continents now. I'm going to introduce Dr. Nikita Zaninovich. He's an associate professor at Cornell University, director of Embryology lab there, and he is a principal investigator in stem cell derivation lab. He has many publications and as well a patent on AI, and I'm sure he's going to be talking an interesting talk on artificial intelligence and time lapse coming through. Over to you, Nikita.
Yes, good morning. Good morning from New York. I want to first thank Alex and everybody who organized this interesting time-lapse webinar. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen, if I may. You need to close your screen, please. Okay, so the topic of my talk this morning will be about what is the experience of the Cornell as one of the large IVF centers in the United States and one of the centers who actually use time-lapse exclusively. And we'll discuss a little bit how we did it, why we did it, and why we still believe in time-lapse technology. I have no conflict of interest. I just want to state it that at Cornell, we are 100% time-lapse for every patient. And we also, with using time-lapse, we are also 100% reduced oxygen. So even very early, let's say early, in 2003, we kind of noticed by just observing the embryo development that there are certain time points in the development that are very important or crucial. And if we observe the embryos in specific time points, let's say 24 hours after fertilization, after ICSI, or let's say 66 hours, which will be day 3 in the morning, we would like to see certain development of the embryos that will indicate the quality of that embryo. So early on, we kind of discover, or we figured out that the timing of the embryo development is quite important. However,
sorry, can you share your screen? We can't see the slides, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Sorry, my apologies. So go back, just talking about the timing of the embryo development without time-lapse. It's important to know that there are certain parameters that we want to observe before we use embryos for transfer. A little bit about the history of the time-lapse. We started really with Diane Payne in '97 when she started showing some early videos of fertilization and 2PN development, but it was not be able to use it in the commercial way or in the clinical way. And not until papers from Wong and Messiger that we were able to discover the effect of timings, the effect of morphokinetics, and how we can use this in the clinical setting. So why we use time-lapse? It was already measured, stable environment, reduced handling, continued observation. We have morphokinetics, flexibility, and it's about the transition from analog to digital. There are many different systems on the market. I'm not going to discuss much about it because it will be discussed further. We primarily use EmbryoScope, so all my experience and data will be about the EmbryoScope. But of course, there are other systems on the market like Jerry and Miri, and there are some other systems that were developed previously that were currently discontinued, where cameras will be introduced in the existing incubator, and then we'll be analyzing the images from it. So it was already mentioned, why is this important? That we have an integrated system, that we have a stable environment, that it's safe for our embryo development. And the other thing that is noticed, that the speed or development of the embryo, or what we call morphokinetics, will be influenced by many different points. Not only from the clinical part, like female age or even paternal age and paternal factors, but also of everything else what we do in the lab, starting from the culture conditions, starting from the oxygen consumption, starting what type of media we are using. So all these things can actually influence the development of the embryo. This is how we have a lab in the Cornell. We actually have a 7 E+ embryoscopes with the 2 old ones. And if you can see on the left-hand side, on the first embryoscope, we still have, that's the first embryoscope we got in 2009. And there is a nil signature on it, still there. So really, what about the time lapse? Well, we really, for the first time, we can actually observe how embryos develop, what embryos needs to do to get to the stage of what we want, and how to do that. So it's really fascinating that we can do this for the first time. And we also learn some basic embryology, like embryo has to go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 stage before it go to compaction, and then it start formation of the blastocyst. And how the formation of the blastocyst, the cells in the inside of the embryo will create ICM, the cell outside surfactant. So this is really a knowledge, a new knowledge, but it's also confirmation of what we know before. So what's the crucial? Well, if we don't have a time lapse, in the conventional way, we actually look at the embryos and there's fixed time. And looking at embryos on the fixed time, it just tell you the snapshot of that embryo at that particular time. It doesn't really tell you when and how this embryo really divide and what time the embryo will be 2-cell, 4-cell, or 8-cell. So we are actually moving from 3-dimensional to the 4-dimensional system because we are adding a time to it. So how can you use this? Well, now we can really observe novelty about, we can look at what is the time of cytokinesis, how long that cytokinesis really it lasts. Also, we can look at it, what is the cell cycle duration between 2-cell to 3-cell? How much time the embryo should have? Well, we now know it's about 10 to 12 hours. What happens if it's like 24 hours? Well, embryo is probably delayed. So all these things can be now observed, but not only observed, we can actually quantify it in the digital way. So as mentioned before, there are recent guidelines how to use a time lapse from ESHRE. I'm not going to go through this. I hope everybody can just download it and read it. But there is like a new language now. And if you see on the left-hand side, you have all these T2, TPNF, all these languages, what we are talking about. That just means that time to 2PN. T2 means time to 2-cell, and so on and so on. So this is a little bit different language. Also, there are different introduction of different nomenclature, which is saying what is abnormal division, what is direct cleavage, what is reverse cleavage. All these things that we didn't know that exist in human embryo development. At Cornell, we have our own set of annotations. Many things we have to do it in-house because many of the available guided annotations or even kit scores are not available in the United States. So we have to do it on our own. So we, of course, annotate all the T times, but we also very high on the user-defined variables. We like to look at what is the abnormalities of cytokinesis, especially ducts, what I will explain a little bit further, cell fusion, abnormality of karyokinesis, like multinucleated blastomeres or nuclear division without cytoplasmic division, which we call NUC. We also observe morphology. We annotate if it's transferred on what day, and we also annotate all the cryos. So we have like a complete picture of every embryo of every patient. How we implement embryoscope in Cornell, we started in 2011 with the first embryoscope. Very soon we got the second instrument so we can play with the oxygen concentration and see if reduced oxygen is actually giving us a benefit of it, which it does. After these initial results, we actually concluded that this is the way to go. And we actually try to purchase as many embryoscopes we can so we can continually have all our patients, which is about 3,500 patients a year, that we can have in embryoscopes. So we at one moment, we have like 11 embryoscopes. With the development of the new system, E+, which is fantastic for us, we actually was able to now to completely switch to that. So it is a process that we started in 2011. Now it is 2020. So we have almost 10 years of experience using embryoscope. Now, how we evaluate the embryoscope, if we start using it, we did the mouse assay, we did the blastocyst development assay, we did a split control study with the sibling oocytes. All these things were done before we decide that we're gonna really go this route. And just briefly, how we made that decision, we actually played with the embryoscope, we did 5% oxygen versus 20% oxygen versus standard incubator. And when we look at the results, we can see that it's clear benefits if we're using embryoscope with the 5% oxygen. So this is, for us, these results were key to move on. The other point that we try to see, if we put embryos, oocytes after ICSI immediately, or we put after the next day after 2 p.m. fertilization. And we see the benefits if we put them immediately after ICSI, and that's how we do now. And the reason is simple, it's just that you are culturing them in the 5% oxygen much earlier. So not only that we can look at the timings and everything else, but there are other things that we can see with the time lapse. And this is the example how there is a fertilization that doesn't really occur normally. This is a sperm head, and there is a formation of 2 p.m., but it came from the second polar body. So there is a sperm head still here near the near pronucleus. And this is actually an example what the parthenogenetic activation will be. So we can observe even these instances when we think that the normal fertilization occur. Now, we are looking a lot about abnormalities, and we discover quite a bit of abnormality of human embryo development. Number one is a DUX, which is direct unequal cleavage, which is cleavage from 1 cell to 3 cell. And this is happening about 25% of the embryos, so it's very frequent. The other thing is a cell fusion. We can see that. We can see nuclear division without cytoplasmic division, and we can see cell non-division in MMB. So all these things can be observed. Why we are so keen about DUX? Because they are very negatively associated with the embryo development and implantation. So we study this quite a bit, that these DUX can happen on the first division, on second or third, so we call this DUC1, DUC2, or DUC3. And actually, this is the example how this will look like. Normal fertilization, 2 p.m., and then suddenly went directly to 3 cells. Each cell has a nucleus. And now suddenly you have 6 cells, but this is completely abnormal. Let's move on. DUC2, you have normal division to 2 cell, and then one of the 2 cells will cleave to 3, and then you end up with 5 cells, like now. So this is abnormality, and we need to recognize it. DUC3 actually represent the least problem because it's happening after the 3rd division, so after 4-cell stage, when one of the 4 cells cleave to 3, and then you end up with 9-cell embryos. These, and it's a bottom blastomeres cleave to 3. So if you look at it further and you move it to the blastocyst stage, you will see that these DUC daughter cells are actually extruded from the embryo development. So they are kind of pushed out, almost like a self-rescue. So we studied that, we published it. I'm not going to go through this much, but it's definitely one of the most negative effects of the cell division or abnormal cell division in embryo development. We actually associate this DUC occurrence with some maternal variation of PLK4 factor, which is a master regulator of mitotic division. So there might be some genetic link to these particular events. So is it a chicken, or is it an egg, or no, we will say it's a duck. So why we did this? Well, they will ask, well, do you see benefits out of using time-lapse? Well, we published this in 2016 from a book from Marcos Messiger, when we saw that there is a clear improvement in an overall clinical pregnancy rate, implantation rate, and live birth rate. So for us, it was very clear that we have to go there. Now, what can we use morphokinetics for? Can we morphokinetics predict blastocyst morphology? Can morphokinetics predict implantation? Can morphokinetics predict ploidy? We know that blastocyst morphology will predict implantation, but can also blastocyst morphology predict ploidy? So all these things we can study. Now at Cornell, we have 4 different models that we use. The main thing is that we use age-corrected models, which means we put age, maternal age, inside of the models. I'm not going to go through them, but models are pretty much a scoring model for the synchronicity of the development. The second model is predicting blastocyst development on day 5. The third model is predicting top blastocyst, like 4AA or 3AA blastocyst. And the fourth model will be predicting implantation on day 3. So for us, we first do deselection. We take out all abnormalities, and then we look at from the leftover embryos, what are the best embryos to transfer. Again, one thing that I would like to point out, if you are doing any statistical models, or even if you are trying to do some AI models, always the question is, what is the age factor in the model? And actually we calculate it, it actually is about 0.6. So any model that you are trying to do, and if you want to include age in it, you need to put above 0.6. So I think that's important to say. It was noticed, and it was there are meta-analysis that the time-lapse is favoring comparing to not time-lapse. We're not going to go there, but there's always debate. Now, there is one problem, and I think Niels mentioned it. Now, if you do your methods inside of your own lab, and you're using your own data, if you try to apply that model to some other data, we try to do this with the data from EV in Spain. And we actually compare the data quality, and we compare, can we use the same models to different sets? We noticed that the parameters that are important in the model are the same. However, distribution of the data are different. So the problem is, how can you use this in the kind of universal way? One of the possibilities, like Niels mentioned, to use very large data set of multiple diverse group of patients. Now, there is a lot of things, at least in the US, it's about time-lapse and biopsy. What time-lapse can actually contribute us? Well, I will say, well, time-lapse can tell us what not to biopsy. For example, this embryo will only have a couple of cells divide, but 4 to 5 cells on the left-hand side. Everything else are big fragments. And because of the biological phenomena, these cells will compact and try to cavitate. However, there are so little number of cells in that, let's say, demi-blastocyst, that I will argue that this is not normal blastocyst. It should not be biopsy. This is another example that is very interesting. You have a 2-cell embryo, and one of the 2 cells never divide, the bottom one. The top one will keep dividing, the bottom one will stay like it is. You are basically have almost like a cloning. You are basically having formation of the blastocyst from the single 2-cell embryo, a 2-cell cell. So I don't know, that's another question. Is this a normal blastocyst? Would you ever transfer this? A lot of questions. So I will say that time-lapse can contribute in the PGT cases. It can tell us what to biopsy or what not to biopsy. It can tell us when to biopsy, because we can observe when the embryo become a blastocyst or not, and what part of the blastocyst to biopsy, because there are a lot of differences in the trophectodermal morphology. So can we just use morphokinetics for predicting ploidy of the embryo? Pretty much answer is pretty much no. However, what we discover, if we are looking just at complex abnormal embryos, there is a possibility of creating pretty nice ROC curves of 0.73 if we are looking just between euploid and complex abnormal embryos. So maybe there is something to do with it. So in summary, I will say time-lapse can revolutionize for us. We don't see embryology the same way like we did before. It can give us evaluation of normal and abnormal embryos. We can also use different other technologies combined with the time-lapse, and it really can assist us to get the best embryo. Very briefly, this is coming and it's already here, and we are working hard on it, not only us, but many other people. AI and IVF. How we see AI in, let's say, embryology. First of all, automatic annotations. We don't want to annotate these. We don't want to do this. And Niels is on the right track on there. We also want embryo evaluation to be done by AI, not by humans, because there are very big variations. And how to choose them, it's a very big deal. Now, we can predict embryo implantation. We can maybe predict embryo ploidy, and maybe we can predict miscarriages. So the question always is, can AI really see better than we do? Because we are using a lot of AI work on the images. So I was saying embryology, we can only expand that also to the sperm evaluation and oocyte evaluation. But there are also a lot of AI applications, possible AI applications in clinical evaluation. For example, ovarian reserve evaluation, antral follicle count. There are so huge variations between who is doing it and what they are measuring. Uterine lining, suggestion for optimal stimulation. You can use AI for matching donor recipients, and it's already started to be used in some companies of PGTA results. So this is how I see the future, that we will have AI actually in every part of IVF process, starting from evaluation from the male and female person, evaluation of their history, genetics, everything else, complete diagnosis, helping us in embryology, and then ultimately basically tell us what we're supposed to do. Should we transfer? Should we freeze? What should we do? So with this, I would like to thank you for attention, and I will say, don't be afraid. AI is not gonna replace us. It's just gonna help us to be much more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikita. Excellent presentation again. Just gonna share my screen. Right, so we're doing very well. We're tracking on time nicely with the presentation, which is, thank you for the speakers for that. I have a pleasure to introduce Dr. Diego Escura. He is the head of global customer engagement at Merck, and he has a very long experience in ART in both clinical and research. He ran his own ART business in South America, and he has a very long experience in biopharmaceutical industries. And he has lots of publications as well. So over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Walid. Let me share my screen. So let's see. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Now?
No, yeah, when you share, you have to select it and press share in the lower right corner, I think.
Okay, just
Two-step
I'm
process.
doing it right now. Just wait me a second. Is it there right now?
Yeah, if you go to presentation mode so we can see the full screen, will be great. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Can you see it now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love, the only thing that I don't love is I cannot see myself, but you know what? One of the things I really love is to be part of this meeting that was organized, beautiful meeting organized by Alex and Walid. Thank you so much for the nice introduction. And I will try to take a different angle, okay, because it looks like we are just doing things in different ways, but I will try to just present a few things, okay? The first thing first is a disclaimer. Like we all know, I'm an employee from Merck, okay? And there are many things that you need to read here, so you can read it later because we don't have the time. But the reality is, like, I'm a Merck employee, and that's very important for you to know, okay? Now, the other thing that is very important for you to understand is I've been working in ART for a long, long time, okay? And look, I used to have hair. That was in 1982 in Argentina. I work all over South America and all over the world. And there you have my partner that now is in New Zealand. Our labs were not as good as normal labs that we have now. We work in the most incredible and different conditions that you may imagine, but we did really well. And one of the things that we learned over those periods of time, and it was a long time of my life working in animals and setting up like private labs, was that as an embryologist, you really need to think like an embryo, okay? Really need to think that the embryo is being generated, and every detail that you have on the step of evolution and development of this embryo, including the assessment, is as important as the other. And one step and one little change can add 1% increase in implantation rate, the other 1.5. So the better you are in defining those moments of excellence that will keep the embryo, the BIP condition, is the best for the embryo, is the best for implantation, is the best for generating a baby or a pregnancy, okay? So this is quite important. And I think that I like to talk a little about incubation and principles that I truly believe on, because it is what it is, okay? It's like we're embryologists and we work with embryos. Now, I love this because this is exactly what happened. I love Jack Cohen is a very smart embryologist that always think like an embryo and always try to find out those little details to improve the final outcome. And he said that the ultimate goal of IVF is to achieve a healthy single live birth following each single embryo transfer. The work that we're doing is fantastic, okay? But this work that we're doing needs to be looking at how to develop in the best conditions the embryos, how to identify in the best conditions of those embryos to maximize their implantation rate. That's where it's measured what we are doing as embryologists. So I would say the same thing, you know, with incubators evolve over time. And I still remember the first incubators that we have in 1982. And I still remember that we have to put the pan of water inside. I still remember my mentor that was Leonello Campara from Italy put me in a lab that I have humidity. You know what he used to do is he used to put like a pan right there and one of those heaters, and it was like entering into a sauna just to look the area we were looking at the embryos. It was incredible, but we worked like that. Okay, it was a long time ago. Then there came some other technologies like we're going to see now that were the second generation, and they were like thinking with good common sense, thinking how can we improve this? Well, reduce the size, you know what, have individual chambers. In this particular case, the Mink incubator that was generated by Genera, okay, is like thinking about, you know, how you can add humidity too, okay, thinking about that. And then it came the third generation, that was what we're talking about now. And we need to think about the evolution. Everything evolves, okay, and we need to think about how things evolve for the future. And looking at this, obviously, the culture media also evolved. They went from media that I used to prepare, I used to, you know, what, inactivate the fetal count serum that we used at that time, and we used to weigh the content, the materials. We used to do everything. Now it's so simple, you know. It comes in a bottle. It's like piece of cake, okay? We measure osmolality, we measure pH, we did everything, okay? And it was beautiful because you truly understand the importance of those little tiny details that you need to manage to maximize the outcome. So I'm going to talk about something that I truly believe, okay? I love nature, I love technology, but I think that we need to think about this very carefully when we're talking about embryos. And there is an biological lab that is the oviduct, okay? The oviduct in the humans or the animals is the lab, okay, where the embryos are being fertilized, where the embryos are being cultured. So let's look at the conditions of this little tiny lab, where the embryo remains almost 7 days in there, depending on the species. It takes a little faster or slower, but they remain there, and they have controlled temperature, they have controlled gas environment, they have controlled nutrition, they have controlled humidity, okay? And this is something that you need to remember, and it's quite important to remember this. This is something that is making a difference. It's a closed environment, like it's been said by Nikika and Walid and Niels. It's very important. It is closed, okay? And does it make a difference? Yes, it makes a difference. I think that some others are going to show this. But the problem is that if it is closed, we need to use a single media. And single-step media makes a difference. Yes, it's going to be some other information, but the reality is this information was generated with Jerry, and I think that Teja is going to show a little more about this. There is a difference. Now, this is a key point, that the part that I'm still trying to understand why this is like it is at this point of time, okay? We know perfectly well, and we saw that many times when we're using these dishes, okay, in our incubators, that you have evaporation, obviously. By that time, at the very beginning, we were not using oil, okay, then we use oil, then we use different kind of ways, okay? But one thing that is clear, if you increase the temperature, you have more evaporation. If you increase your airflow, you have more evaporation. If you increase the time of culture, you increase evaporation. When you increase the volume, you reduce the chances. And when you increase the humidity, you reduce the chances. And what happens when you have evaporation in media, whatever the media that you have, is that you're going to have a change on what? Osmolality. So the embryos are going to be you know, if you increase osmolarity, you're going to start shrinking the embryos because the water of the embryos is going to go out just to compensate for the difference in the osmotic pressure. So, and that will change what? Will also change pH. And you know what? And I cannot understand yet how can we generalize in the field of fertility, always trying to say, well, you know what, there's no difference, there's no problem, nothing happened. You know what, you can use dry. Go to nature, okay? And think about this, okay? It's the little changes on osmolarity could be 280, 300, whatever the values, will depend on what you have right there, okay? Because it's not going to be the same an embryo that is being generated from a woman that is 25 years old or a woman that is 55 years old. I am telling you, I'm not the same guy that I was when I was 25. It's a little different. The cells are getting older. As you saw, my cells here are getting older, no more hair, okay? So think about this. The sensitivity of the cells is different, okay? So we need to be very careful when we generalize concepts. What we need to think is what we need to do for that particular kind of embryo, okay? And how to control the conditions to the maximum level of efficiency to continue growing that implantation rate, which is so important, okay? And we know this in the animal field for a long, long time, okay? This paper is from 1980, it's 40 years old, and we know that there is fluid in the rabbit oviducts, okay? But people are going to say, yeah, this is animals, it's not humans, sorry. I recommend you to read this paper from Marie Saint-Dizier from 2019, pretty new, okay? French people are very smart in general looking at all these details. And they're looking at something, and this paper is basically saying that the oviduct lumen is a dynamic milieu in which oviductal secretions are constantly renewed. If you look at the cow, for example, you're going to find out 0.2 milliliter per day during the luteal phase and 2 milliliter per day during estrus. The collection is with what they did, the oviduct, they just look at the oviduct, which is the environment of the embryo, 3 microliters per minute on day 3 of the estrous cycle. And this is critical in that period of time, fertilization, early culture, okay? So think about this, okay? This is a detail that we cannot come and say, oh, it's not important, okay? Oh, you can have contamination. Well, I'm sorry, it is important, okay? And needs to be considered, and it will be more or less important for different kind of embryos that we're gonna have. And this has been proven, okay, that even in environments where you have humidity or not humidity, with oil or with not oil, well, you have a change in osmolarity. There were like some papers that were presented at this ESHRE, 2 posters, one from Embryo Tools, Garcia Jimenez, where they tested different dishes, they tested different machines, they tested everything, and they found out that there's a difference, okay? Even there's another paper from Cornell Albert that talk about humidity, and she showed the differences in pregnancy and implantation. And the most beautiful thing is like, you don't know if the osmolarity, as being shown by Jason, is changing the pH. It changed the pH, okay? So you do not know if these stressors are the effect of the environment for pH, the osmolarity, or what, but they are affecting the embryo. And there's a beautiful paper done by the Gallego in 2018, already published, a final one, and where they show that, well, if you have a dry environment, okay, you have more oxidative stress. That's it. End of the story. And that will impact, like shown by Carmela Albert, the implantation and the pregnancy rate. It is a detail. I'm not saying that it's the most important. It's one of the 300 details that we have in the lab that we must control, okay? We do not live in an environment that is dry. It's like we have humidity, okay? And our cells are not that different than the cells of the embryo that are the ones that originate us, okay? So think about that. So now looking at the Gary incubator, after all that being said, this is an incubator that's been done by embryologists, for embryologists. And I think that it's gonna be explained by Teja. The group that generated this was Genea in Sydney, Australia, where they normally, since the very beginning, they invested money to try, part of the money that they get, they invested that money to try to bring better technologies that will help them improve efficacy on a clinical side, efficacy on the operational side, efficacy on a business side, because it's a group of centers of IVF. And there are three people that I really need to recognize that are incredibly good, and probably the originators of this one was Steve MacArthur, Tammy Roy, and one that was a brain, I still remember when this machine didn't exist, that was Thomas Stoyanov, that was scientific director by that time, and he was having different ideas. So what they did is they utilized the expertise of really good embryologists together with a company, Planet Innovation, just to guide the engineers and secure that they produce what they want. A machine that covers all these characteristics that I mentioned before, okay? And what they look is like they started making questions, as you can see in this movie. They tried to buy their own incubator. And as you know, they built before the Mink incubator with humidity and closed environment, the smaller. They were the creators of that machine. And they said, well, let's go to the next step. So they built individual chambers. The Mink was not individual. They just look at individual CO2 sensors to monitor real-time CO2. They have multiple heating elements on both sides just to secure that the temperature that is so important, if one plate fails, the other one will take over, okay? And they say, why not have an individual microscope? So they have individual microscope, high quality, in each one of the chambers to secure that you can track the embryos. And you can look at everything, not only in bright field, but also in dark field. They also have an important thing, which is securing that they have individual gas, reach for the chamber, and a purge. When you open and you close, you change the amount of gas that you enter into the chamber to purge. And they designed a beautiful dish that was clearly designed based on the conditions that they were using in their own labs at that point of time, to try to avoid just having too many embryos or too many patients in one place, and securing that the quality of this machine is going to be the best for what they're doing, okay? So you have undisturbed incubation, zero doubts about it. Oviduct is closed. Nikika said, is very clear and incredibly important. The other thing that is important is, like, I'm not sure if you like cooking. I like cooking, okay? And if you open the oven, when you just open it, when the cake is going up, you can have gas in this way, okay? And this is exactly what happened. What happened in the embryo, I have no idea. But there is an effect as it's being shown in the clinical results. And I don't know which part of the stress is creating the problem. They have one chamber per patient, which is incredibly important. They have, like I said before, 4 redundant plates for temperature. They have individual, with gas environments, and they have everything is connected to external sensors. So they're going to be able, you can track it from the outside too. So you can have control temperature, control CO2, and control humidity. And I'm telling you, I'm sure that anyone that produces an incubator just come and say, like, try to add humidity. And it's very complicated. It's complicated because the sensors need to be very special. And if the sensors are not very special, then you're going to have the sensors of CO2, not only the humidity ones, then you're going to have a problem. So they work really hard, and they get to this incubator with these conditions that are actually getting, with the possibility to have humidity. Humidified incubation, transfer dish equilibration, Gary dish with 16 microwells. Those are the sizes, okay? 400 microns, 500 on top, and 430. Everything was designed in a way to secure that they get the best conditions based on the experience of not one embryologist, a group of very highly experienced embryologists, okay? And they had the cameras, and the cameras are actually just trying to collect as much information as possible, which is great. But there are some problems, okay? And I love technology. I still remember the day that I saw the first time-lapse machine in the World IVF. It was an embryoscope in 2008, I think, if I remember well. And I said, this is it, okay? This time-lapse technology is going to revolutionize the way of doing things. And at that point of time, when I start seeing the movies that I see, I learned that after almost, 30 years of working in embryology, I knew this little. There's so much to learn. These machines help us learn much more, okay? Now, the biggest problem is that you collect so much data that you need to input manually initially, okay, that it's not possible. You can do it, but you need to have so much work, so complicated. So that's the point that we came with this EVA technology, that maybe you didn't know that, but you need to have flexible software solutions that are giving you the possibility to capture the data automatically and analyze the data automatically. And this solution came from Stanford University. We get involved with the technology a long time ago, okay? And we evolved this technology, and it's the first technology, even though it's not being said, that those post-P3 analyses and the characteristics, kinetics of development were managed by artificial intelligence at Stanford and a group of people from Silicon Valley that was working on this kind of technology through artificial intelligence, okay? So it's capturing the data information in dark field, and this Gary Plus is just looking at the embryos and classifying the embryos in 5 categories. And what was being shown by Niels, that is true, okay? Well, there is a correlation to kinetics of development, and this post-P3 analysis of characteristics of the embryo analyzed through artificial intelligence that is showing that in 5 categories there is an increase, okay? The better the score, the better the implantation rate. And this is what it's looked like when you look at the machine. What is it doing? It's capturing the information on dark field and bright field. Why in dark field? You say, well, because you can see more details, much more details, okay? And this is the way it normally works. You identify automatically the embryos and annotate the embryos automatically, and then give you a score, okay? So you don't need to do any kind of specific annotation. You're going to have the embryos right there in front of you developing, and then you're going to have the embryo score by the machine, like it's being said before, and then you're going to decide which is going to be the one that you're going to transfer immediately after you do that, okay? The scoring. Now, there are more flexibility solutions. So the company didn't stop with EVA, and they started working on something that is exactly similar to what happened with our technologies like EmbryoScope. And you know what? It's like connecting the machines with computers and avoid getting into the lab to look at the embryo. So they invented Connect and Assess. And Assess what is doing exactly the same thing that we mentioned before. It's capturing the information. The software is capturing the information automatically and is scoring it, okay? And you can have possibilities. You can do it automatically by the machine. You can create your own algorithm because you may not like to work with algorithms from other people, and you can create your own algorithm and you can include it in the machine. The machine is going to be detecting clearly that's the steps of evolution or development of the embryo, and it's going to go directly into the system, and then it's going to score according to the algorithms that you created. So it's like simplicity, okay? You do not need to include the data. You do not need to analyze it. Everything is going to be done by the machine, which is something absolutely fantastic because that's the way it is. And artificial intelligence needs to be involved, and this is what we're doing. This is what everyone is doing, and there's zero doubts about this, that this is the future that we're going to, okay? And I think that this is something really important to consider. We need to really think that the technology is incredibly important and it's everywhere, and it's something that we're using on a continuous basis, and it's something that we need to think about for the future, okay? Don't stop. Don't think about, not doing things. You need to secure that you're not only giving the best conditions for the embryos to culture, but you also need to be secure that you are doing the best to assess those embryos and reach the goal that is being said by Jack Cohen, that I love what he said because I truly believe that is the situation. Now, still some people are discussing these machines. I'm telling you, if this machines cost the same amount of money that costs regular incubator, every incubator around the world is going to be like this. So I always said, you know what, that to look at, to predict the future, you need to analyze the past, okay? And then you may try to do this. So I was thinking that, you know what, if you look at the evolution of different kind of technologies, of phones, I'm not sure if you have it. I still have the ones that were created in 1986 in a farm that I have in Argentina. I also have the machines, that gramophone that you can see there, this one right here, okay? Still have it in the farm with the old disc. And look at the evolution. Some people were saying that, you know what, Graham Bell was crazy. They didn't support it. Look at the evolutions of computers, you know. Things are like evolving over time. So think about the past. Think about technologies. We're in a digital era. This is incredibly important. Remember, look at the past and don't get stuck. Oh, this is good. This is not good. Look at what Teja is going to say later on. I want to leave you with 3 last thoughts, okay, that for me are important within me. Be pragmatic, embryologists, and use the common sense. Use the common sense to look at those details that are going to make a difference, okay? Think as an embryo that wants to become a baby. Think what you need to do for this embryo to maximize the possibilities of developing. And face and embrace the lab technologies to increase efficacy. And I think that Teja is going to talk a little about this. It's not about the cost of a product. It's about the efficacies that you're getting when you're getting this kind of technologies. Thank you so much. I love embryology and I love this meeting and all the people that are part of it. Okay. Thank you so much, Walid.
Thank you, Diego. Do you mind unsharing your screen so I can share mine?
Yes, please? Sir. Yes, and share. Stop share. Good. I'm so passionate about embryology, you cannot imagine. So I love all these guys that are here in this meeting.
No, that's very good. Thank you, Diego. Dr. Teja Pera, she got a PhD and background in academic and applied research in reproductive biotechnology. She done transgenics, cloning livestock, and works in stem cells as well. She has a role as innovation manager at Genea Biomedex, and she focuses on product development, IP regulatory affairs, and collaboration with Genea Fertility IVF. Over to you, Teja.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I try to share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a 2-step process. You have to press share at the lower right corner as well.
Oh, okay. How about now?
Yep, and if you go to present mode, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you everybody for laying a stage so well about the time-lapse technology in the IVF field. And thank you especially, Diego, for explaining the cherry system, so I don't really have to go into details about that. So I'm going to talk about the Genea clinics experience and the benefits that they have gained from the time-lapse implementation. And here I have to recognize especially the people who actually did the work, being colleagues at the Genea Fertility, Andrew Murray, Natalie Hiresketh, Sarah Dalati, and Steve MacArthur. And I will give some declarations. And indeed, Genea Biomedex is a medical device developer and manufacturer, and it is part of the Genea group. Whereas Genea Fertility is a chain of IVF clinics, which provides a range of IVF-associated services. It is also part of the Genea group. But all the clinical studies and experiences that I'm talking about today were conducted at and drawn from Genea Fertility without any influence from Genea Biomedex. And indeed, I work at Biomedex, but my colleagues work at the Genea group or Fertility at Genea. And as for how many clinics we have, there is about 10 IVF clinics in Australia and in New Zealand, plus a few more clinics that provide more limited services, blood sampling, ultrasound monitoring, and so forth. And altogether, these clinics, they conduct approximately 5,000 cycles per year. The flagship clinic being in Sydney, which conducts over 2,000 cycles per year. So all these experience are collected from all these clinics. So it is, again, not the one clinic, not one embryologist operation. And because we have these two different business units within one wider group, we have this thing that we like to call general virtuous cycle, where clinical services, indeed, they tell what they want, and the automation technology then goes and develops the products with the continuous feedback from the clinical needs. And then once the systems are being developed, then they are implemented in the clinic, and then we get further feedback of those. And there in between there is research and development, and that's where I interact. So for example, for this presentation, I have worked very closely with fertility clinics to get this analysis done and collect this data. And again, I still work continuously with them with some new development areas. I have said this before, and I said it again. IVF is actually a chain of events, and all of these events have to be successful in order to lead to a successful outcome. So indeed, embryos are there. Clinics are obviously an important factor. Patients, what happens to them and their own experiences there are important, as are the doctors, especially for clinics such as Genea, who actually doesn't engage the doctors directly. They are not our employees, as they are independent operators, and they could choose to divert patients to any IVF clinic, as well as a society in countries where IVF is supported by public funding. And especially in relation of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Cherry and the time-lapse system and how that actually can strengthen all those links. And quite often in a traditional discussion of new IVF systems, the focus is on clinical components like embryo development and implantation and live births. However, in this world of increased use of ART and increased competition, an ideal practical clinical setup focuses on benefits of the whole IVF value chain. And that is my approach where I'm coming from. So this is not going to be high science, but this is a very practical look of how the time-lapse actually affects the clinic. So first, looking at embryos, obviously the biggest aims are to support embryo development, get highest possible number of good quality embryos, and also to get best possible pregnancy and live birth chances by choosing the best embryos. And this is where we at Genea, we see that this time-lapse system is really optimal because it provides these optimal culture conditions. And in addition, it also provides tools to choose best embryo for transfer to achieve the pregnancy faster. And I think that previous speakers already covered the history, so I will not go into these trends. Only highlight that indeed this humidity question seems to have raised its head again over the recent years. And indeed, the morphologic assessment has giving more space to more modern techniques, PGT, morphokinetics, and AI. And there on the background lurks also the media. And that is important. It has a good relationship with incubators because especially the time-lapse incubators now allow the possibility for embryos to stay undisturbed without changing media, as happens with the sequential media. On the other hand, studies previously have shown that the sequential media is beneficial for embryo outcomes. So how to choose between these two and how one benefit is overtaken by another. So challenges faced by Genea clinics and I suppose all IVF clinics are indeed manifold. How to improve embryo development rates and pregnancies, how to improve patient management, how to improve operations, and how to improve efficiencies and costs. And the challenges in all these areas are, how to make all of these things better, more efficient, faster, more flexible. And the benefits are manifold, not only indeed in the actual clinical outcome field, but also the matter of reduced risks, reduced workload, standardizing the processes, and all of this leading into savings and increased competitiveness. And again, addressing in this talk mainly from the time-lapse point of view. So quite early on, Genea clinics realized that time-lapse is something that they want to do, and without rushing ahead and doing these changes without proper due process, they also realized that they have to study the impact of change in a very holistic and controlled way, and indeed look not only at the embryo culture but also in the operations factors. And one of the first things they did after the Biomedics launched the Cherry Incubator several years ago was do the clinical evaluation, comparing it into the previous system that they had successfully used in the laboratories for many years, which was the Mink benchtop incubator. And both of these systems used high humidity. And in order to keep one key factor stable, all the embryos were cultured in the same media, which was a sequential media. And that is important to note because even though the time-lapse was used, the culture was not fully undisturbed in any case because of the media change need. And they conducted two different types of studies. The first one was the prospective sibling zygote studies, where zygotes were divided between the old and the new, and then the best embryos were transferred regardless of what group they came from, either as fresh or after cryopreservation or after cryopreservation and PGT for ploid. And this shorter duration, one clinic 6-month study was then followed because the results were so positive, was followed with the implementation into further clinics of the new system and a retrospective patient cohort study where data was collected from a fixed period just before and after the change of the system. And as you can see, these studies were conducted a few years ago already, and that allowed us to follow the cumulative outcomes for up to 2 years to get a better and more rounded picture of the success. So what was noticed in this prospective study was that indeed, immediately, the time-lapse caused a significantly higher number of embryos to develop into a top-grade blastocysts, the grades 1 and 2, and overall more utilized top-grade blastocysts. And consequently, because obviously embryos were chosen, the best ones first for the PGT biopsies as well as for the transfers, meant that more embryos were chosen for further embryo transfer cases. And PGD ploidy outcomes were comparable between the groups, so there was no difference there. Nonetheless, there were no differences in the pregnancy rates that were achieved, but because of this cumulative nature of how more embryos were available and were actually utilized, that led to a cumulatively higher number of pregnancies obtained from the time-lapse group. And the retrospective patient cohort study results reflect the previous results. So again, we could see the significantly higher blastocyst development, no difference in pregnancy rates or live birth rates, but because of the cumulative nature, overall, the more pregnancies were obtained from time-lapse group. And as I mentioned, the media is a big factor in a way how you actually use the time-lapse. So Genea clinics conducted also a clinical evaluation comparing the sequential versus continuous media. And again, to keep one factor steady, all the embryos were cultured in Cherry. And the study design was very similar. So again, prospective studies followed by retrospective studies, and all the cumulative outcomes were followed for up to 2 years. And I'm showing here only the results of the retrospective patient cohort study because largely the results of the prospective study were very similar. The only difference was that in the prospective study, although there was a trend towards a higher number of top blastocysts, the difference was not statistically significant. But here now with almost 5,000 zygotes, that actually from the original 500 embryos, that difference actually had become statistically significant. Nonetheless, there were no differences in the pregnancy rate. But again, the cumulative impact meant that more pregnancies were obtained from that continuous media group. And after those positive results, the Genea clinics made the uniform decision to move into the continuous media and cherry incubation in all their clinics. And of course, they were also interested in comparing how that combined system compared to their previous system. And for that, a retrospective follow-up study, which was quite substantial, covering 16 months and 5 clinics, were conducted to compare the two systems to each other. And again, cumulative outcomes were followed for up to 2 years. And in between, you see there was a period when all these different implementation tests and studies were conducted. And no surprises, indeed, the combination of continuous media and time-lapse resulted in significantly higher development rates, which surprised absolutely nobody. However, interestingly, this time, and maybe largely because of the significantly higher number of embryos as well, overall this study covered about 40,000 cycles. Also, the pregnancy rates were significantly higher in this new system. And that, of course, means higher overall cycle success rates. And it means that this new culture system increases chances of achieving family from one cycle of IVF. And that I have to emphasize because that is really important for Genea, and I'm sure for many clinics, or any clinic, I should say, because that means that the patient can come to a clinic, they can have their one oocyte pickup cycle, embryos transferred fresh, some embryos frozen, they maybe have a child, come back in a few years' time, have another child. And that's, the best possible way to treat our patients. That's what we feel. The impact of humidity, that has already been touched upon. Diego talked about it quite a lot. So I guess the difference with cherry is that indeed it allows a choice of either dry or humid culture. And early on, we conducted studies both at the fertility clinics as well as at the biomedics, exploring different dish scenarios and how they actually operate in a cherry incubator specifically. And the comparatives were done between the conventional 60 ml Falcon dish with 20 microliter drops, which used to be the previous standard how embryos were cultured, versus the new cherry culture dish used as a manufacturer's instructions. And here we can see that indeed, and we did some further analysis as well, the size and shape of drop, the drop volume and surface area ratio of media and oil, they are quite different, and they probably explain some of the results. Without going too much into details here, I'm just highlighting here that surrounded by red is the scenarios which represent the worst case and the best scenario can be achieved with the Falcon dish, with either kind of, just enough oil to cover the drops or the maximum amount of oil. And then we have here on the left-hand side, we have the cherry dish. So it's interesting to notice that even in the absolutely optimal scenario situation, the rise in osmolality is still higher in the Falcon dish as opposed to the cherry dish. And this was indeed after about 5.7 days of culture. And then if looking only at the cherry dishes, again, there's various different scenarios trying different volumes of media, volumes of oil, how using either dry or humid cherry. And at this point, we were still trying to find conditions where we would be able to actually culture embryos in a dry cherry incubator without actually affecting the osmolality. And I think that we got very close to it. But this is where the fact that, fertility is completely independent operator and does make their own decision came into effect, that they actually didn't want to do any actual clinical studies comparing the dry and humid, because by that time there had already been some studies shown about the impact of humidity, the increased development rates and increased pregnancy rates. And obviously osmolality is a big factor, but some of these studies had also used sequential media, where the media was changed frequently, meaning that osmolality at least alone couldn't be a factor for the beneficial outcome. So Genia Clinics made the decision that they didn't want to do any dry culture, and because of the cherry, they didn't have to. So we didn't actually do those culture experiments then at the clinics. However, what other things could be done at the clinics was that because this new embryo culture system was now installed, it allowed various different changes in the clinical operations to optimize and standardize them in order to reduce workload, risk, and costs. And some examples of these clinical process changes were short insemination IVF, where the putative cycles could be transferred into the cherry culture dish quite soon, meaning that the subsequent fertilization checks could be done remotely and completely time independent. And another example was hatching on a culture dish rather than moving embryo around into a separate dish for a biopsy, hatching. And of course, the improved embryo assessment using the software became into clinical processes as well. Indeed, aim being the flexible work practices and other benefits gained from that. So indeed, the common practice for hatching involves removing the embryo into a separate handling dish and then doing the laser hatching there. But it's obviously quite counterintuitive to an uninterrupted culture, because lots of handling, lots of ambient conditions and so forth. So Genia Clinics, they wanted to get away from that, but there were some concerns whether the actual exposing the embryos and the media into a laser, especially in such a tiny well as the cherry dish wells are, whether that would be actually harmful to the embryos if you keep on continuing your embryo culture in that same dish. So they conducted a study of over 6,000 embryos where happily it was found that the embryo development and utilization rates were comparable irrespective of what hatching system was used. So indeed, after that, this new system was taken into use, and that obviously saved quite a lot of time and effort, and also risk of handling embryo. Automated annotations in cherry assess, Diego already mentioned. So again, it's based on the convolutional neural network teaching of the software, where it actually analyzes the images and detects whether embryo cleavage or whether embryo has achieved a certain development stage. And what it also does is that it actually has these time ranges. And if the developmental event that is recorded falls outside the time range, then the user is alerted to that. And quite often it happens because the irregular morphology or development of the embryo. Like for example, in this real case scenario, this is an embryo that was detected to be a 5-cell stage, but because it happened so much later than it actually should be expected to happen, this immediately alerts embryologists that there's something funny going on with this embryo, especially because a couple of subsequent events were also off the scale. And that means that the embryologist can go and manually then annotate these embryos. And I probably don't go through this video because, again, Diego already showed it. But indeed, the annotated events are captured time bar, and then they can be compared there. And what it also does is that because all this data can be downloaded as a CSV sheet, and depending on the clinic system, they can add their unique embryo ID there, and basically do all kind of data analysis, do simple pivot tables. They can, transfer the timing of the events into hours if they don't like to work with seconds as the default system is. And also these sheets can be then linked with the clinic database information, with all kind of information. Whatever you collect about your embryos and patients, then you can link into these timed events. And that, of course, works as a tool for various analysis needs and research. So again, I skipped these morphokinetic algorithms because Diego already mentioned them. I only again mentioned the Genia example because these algorithms can be specific. What is beauty of this automated annotation is that because they are collected all the time in the background without any effort from the embryologist, so they can be analyzed if wanted without any extra effort using in silico models. And this is what was done. 4 well-known algorithms were analyzed retrospectively using the clinical data. And because the idea was that, would these algorithms actually work just, quietly on the background without indeed embryologists having to manually annotate the events. So they were based only on the timings with no further morphokinetic special observations. And one example of these algorithms that were used in this study was this one, the Basil from 2015, where this algorithm was translated into a kind of a language that the Cherry software understands and implemented into the Cherry system. And the main parameters that were studied were the percentage of utilizable blastocysts and the percentage of fetal heart. And indeed, because this was a retrospective study, so in theory, these algorithms, when they were applied, they should have then had the ability to show increased outcomes the further up you went in the algorithm classing. And unfortunately, no clear linear relationship between algorithm category and outcomes was observed in any of these. There's a little bit of inclinations here and there, but indeed, whether we look at the utilizable blastocysts or fetal hearts, it was not, clearly applicable. However, we have to notice that the number of embryos in some categories was quite low, and also because these algorithms were developed predominantly utilizing early cleavage events, so they might not be suitable for day 5 culture scenario when looking at the ultimate outcomes. And our conclusion was that actually Genia Clinic might also need its own unique customizable algorithm, and that work is still ongoing. So why to do all these operational changes and laboratory process changes? Well, trying to increase efficiencies. And obviously, it was immediately obvious that the continuous medium and time-lapse incubator with remote access, they reduce staff time and also allow flexible work. And one very practical aim was to reduce weekend presence, because indeed, out of the 10 clinics, some are very small and they might require only one embryologist to go there over the weekend to do fertilization checks and day 3 checks. So the aim was to kind of, reduce that workload and also allow the movement of staff between the sites. And so the benefit was that indeed approximately 25% overtime reduction in working weekends was achieved by using these new systems. And the efficiency increases were especially notable because they took place during the period where there were more PGT cases, and they of course mean more work. So to cut this short, the clinical efficiency gains by reducing the procedure times, the average savings of 1 hour 20 minutes were achieved per patient over a 3-year period when these new systems were introduced, and about 50% increase in oocyte pickup cycles per embryologist was also introduced. And I have to emphasize that this was not simply number of cycles increasing, because the total number of cycles remained very steady during this time. And there's always limitations and reasons for caution. So there were other small operational changes during this, 4-year period. However, the biggest benefits were traced into the new culture system and time-lapse. Increase in PGTA I already mentioned, the changes in patient cohort because of the increased competition and much more last chance patients coming into big clinics like Genia with lots of different treatment options. Clinic and doctor specific limitations because not doctors, they don't actually work for us, so we cannot tell them what to do. And some changes are still in the process of implementation. And lastly, just a few words about the patients and doctors. What we also wanted to achieve with this thing was the improved patient and doctor experience by providing improved access to information. And obviously, the use of time-lapse videos and pictures means that any clinic using those can share those videos with their patients. However, because of these remote access capabilities, it's also possible to allow patients this remote access. And hence the Genia Fertility Embryo Viewing Portal was established some years ago. And initially it was installed only in one clinic because there were some concerns whether that would actually stress patients rather than bring them ease of mind. And hence there was a survey of the patients in that one clinic after it had been used for a while. And happily, last majority of the patients actually agreed that it increased their IVF experience. It gave them a more feeling of control and allowed them to share their journey with their partner. And it was mainly the technical issues and wish for even greater information that resulted into these 15% neutral or negative scores. And the initial survey was done before the patients knew whether they had become pregnant, but subsequent surveys done after they knew their outcome. And even if the patient didn't get pregnant, they still told that they were more satisfied with their treatment when they actually had access. And likewise, doctors have indicated that their communication with patients was also improved when patients have access to their embryo images and knew more about what's actually going on in their cell. So to kind of summarize, the solutions to these challenges that I explained in the beginning and that the Genia clinics faced, it could be a little bit simplified, but it's fair to say that a solution for many of these challenges and definitely improving the efficiencies, the clinical outcomes, and reducing risks and increasing competitiveness was achieved with the use of time-lapse system and the software continuous media. And there's no way that Genia would go back into the old system. I think that would be inconceivable. So the take-home message was that indeed Genia embraced these new technologies and so that they offer opportunities for improvements, and not only in embryo culture, but in several aspects of IVF clinic operations. And what they also concluded, and we also very much supported Biomedic, is that it's important to do stepwise testing and implementation of key changes before actually embarking to something quite as ambitious as completely changing your culture systems. And on that note, I thank you. And there's no time for questions yet, I realize, but when the questions come, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Theo. I would share my screen. I have a great pleasure to introduce our last speaker today, Alison Campbell. She's the Group Director of Embryology at Care Fertility. She's had 11 labs, 85 scientists, and they do about 10,000 cycles IVF treatment a year. She's a diplomate from the Royal College, highly published, and as well she's editor of a book on time-lapse that is very well cited. And she's as well on many scientific boards as well. So it's a pleasure to introduce Alison today in this final presentation. Alison, over to you. Can't hear you yet. I don't know if your mic.
Yeah, just showing the screen. Try my best. Here we are. Okay, can you see this first slide?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks very much to Walid and Alex and all of the other speakers. It's been fascinating. I'm not going to talk for too long because I'm conscious that there are probably lots of burning questions. A lot of the background's been covered. I'm going to mostly talk about workflow management and use some examples, probably telling a story really, hopefully, as we go along. We've been using time-lapse for many years at Care Fertility, so hopefully I can share some of the lessons with you all and talk about the demonstrable benefits, particularly for workflow. A lot of my slides will talk about fertilization assessment. I think it's a really useful example to demonstrate the benefits on workflow. A little bit about PGTA and just generally at the end, how the lessons that we've learned from time-lapse can be applied to help workflow with standard practice, because I'm conscious that many clinics aren't as fortunate as we are to have access to time-lapse. So I have got some top tips that I can share with you. So here we are. I'm going to try and move that to the side. Here we are. This is the map of the UK with all of our care fertility clinics. Not all of them have full-scale laboratories. Some of those are satellite clinics. But we've got experience with a range of time-lapse devices. So mostly EmbryoScope, but also the Jerry, the ESCO and Primo Vision. So many different devices between 2011 to date. And we're doing around 4,000 time-lapse cycles every year. So you can imagine over that time, we have collated a lot of data, a lot of experience. And our database now is well over 100,000 fully annotated embryos. So we have had the pleasure, I would say, of developing our own models. So we've talked a lot about models so far in this session, and we've developed our own in-house models, which are predictive of live birth. We've had over 2,000 babies born from our time-lapse models. So we can, from what we've heard already, we can see there's a big shift in the way you work from standard practice, snapshot assessments to time-lapse, a really big impact on the workflow. And I'd say looking back, the first few years, there may have been a little bit more labor intensive. As we introduced time-lapse, we wanted to get the very best from it. So we implemented quite a detailed annotation program. And it's over those years that we've reaped the benefits by being able to develop these models and to really see a positive impact on workflow in the laboratories. And we know with standard practice, workflow can be quite complicated, disrupted. We have to have an eye on the clock all the time. The manual assessments are really time critical. And so the time of day, the rotas of the embryologists, it's all very much based on when we need to make these important assessments from our standard practice. So transitioning over to time-lapse brings a huge amount of flexibility and benefits for workflow. So when we first introduced time-lapse back in 2011, we took quite a common sense approach. We didn't have the benefit that people have now of all the literature, all the textbooks, all these presentations. So we had to think, well, what do we expect to see from these photos that are being taken every 5 or 10 minutes? And how do we annotate them and how do we respond to them? We want to choose the very best embryo with the best chance. So we had to just think, well, we know what to expect from mitosis. We want to see the cells keep doubling over time. So if we don't see that, then that could be a bad sign. So we used the tools that were available with the software tools to mark embryos that hadn't developed as we would expect to from the textbooks, but we did have some surprises. We don't use automated annotation yet in our clinics, but we are looking towards that and beyond that to AI. But we set out by considering what we should annotate, how we should do that, and when we need to do that. And this is the key point, when. We wanted to gather a lot of data. We wanted to keep R&D moving. We could see that this was potentially a gold mine of information that we'd be able to apply clinically and give up benefits for our patient and also for working practice. So as I said, initially, I'd say the volume of work increased slightly, but flexibility increased dramatically. If we talk just a little bit about annotation, we know what it is, we've heard from the previous speakers, but I think it's very, very important. And until we have a very reliable automated annotation or completely automated or semi-automated artificial intelligence, we need to put a lot of effort into getting this annotation practice precise, standardized, particularly if you're working in a large team. So you see we've got 11 clinics across the UK, so we spent a huge amount of time invested in getting an annotation policy so that everyone would follow it. It was very clear, strict training. And then I was involved in developing the guidelines for nomenclature, which covered annotation and all of these variables. So make it simple and to hopefully be able to collaborate with other groups and to build even larger database and to share experiences, really. This is just a table that I often pop up just to show one of our teams all of the embryologists are regularly asked to get involved in quality assurance, internal and external quality assurance of time-lapse annotation. And really, this is the only way, alongside an audit schedule, that we can be reassured that annotation is standardized and that the output, the data, is valid and is going to be useful for developing algorithms and helping our patients. So we have so much to think about. I was reflecting to the old days when we were completely using standard practice and no time lapse. All these questions like, should we denude the eggs now? Is it too early? I want to get on. I can see the workload ahead of me, but I don't want to inseminate too soon because we'll have to come in at 6 tomorrow morning to assess the fertilization. So what time is my colleague coming in the morning? What if I miss the pronuclei? Is that at 2 p.m.? Is it 3 p.m.? I need to get it back out later in the day and double check. Do I need to come in on Sunday? Shall I biopsy this embryo now, or do you think it might be better later on? All of these questions. Has that embryo collapsed, or is it not even expanded yet? I mean, we don't know unless we have time lapse and we can look at the videos and we can look at the embryo now, unless we are prepared to disturb them from their culture, and we don't really want to do that either. So introducing time-lapse removes all of these pressures, and it gives a huge amount of flexibility and just improves workflow significantly. So we have the guidelines. They're hopefully going to be updated quite soon, but as it stands, we use the ESHRE and Alpha guidelines broadly across the world, which suggests to us the right time of, in terms of hours post-insemination, when we should check for fertilization, syngamy, embryo development. So the introduction of time-lapse means that we can make an assessment at precisely the recommended time. But some embryos don't behave and divide at precisely the recommended time. So we have this facility with the time-lapse videos to rewind, to call a colleague, to make a second opinion, and to genuinely assess throughout the day whenever it suits our schedule, because we can rewind the clock. So fertilization, I think this is probably the most time-sensitive assessment. If we miss it, then we've lost it. So if you think about the impact on the patient, if you miss the pronuclei, the embryo is going to be categorized as unfertilized. Then it will cleave, but we haven't seen the fertilization, so many embryologists would not be confident to use it. We can go back later. If we have a complete failed fertilization, then we would automatically later in the day. But we do try to avoid the disruption of the culture and opening the doors of the incubators in standard practice. And we know from our own experience that the number of pronuclei can change. If you have one opportunity to see it, then 1.2% of the time, it's going to change. It might not be right. A 2 can become a 3, a 3 can become a 2. So we've done quite a lot of work on this. And what if the embryo cleaves? Yeah, do we use it? Do we send it for PGTA? What if it makes a beautiful blastocyst? You haven't seen the pronuclei. All of these questions are very challenging on a daily basis for embryologists. So 17 plus or minus 1 hours is the recommended time for the fertilization check, according to these broadly used guidelines. And of course, these guidelines reflect the literature, they reflect the expert opinion, and they will hopefully reflect events in the majority of cases. But these guidelines say that this is for IVF and for ICSI embryos, and time-lapse has taught us that that might not be a sensible approach. So here we have 3 images of the same embryo over 2 hours. And in the first one at the top, we can certainly see a single pronucleus, and it looks like 2 polar bodies. The second one is much clearer. So we can see 2 clear pronuclei, 2 polar bodies. And within the same 2-hour window, we've got this larger pronucleus. And what we've seen from time-lapse is that this often doesn't happen. Often the 2 pronuclei remain. It's not the fusion and becoming a large single pronucleus that we might have imagined based on the textbooks. So it's difficult when we're faced with these images, if we didn't have time lapse, to what to decide and how to score these embryos. And it's important to say, and we've heard this already, but I'll just stress the point that there are many factors that can influence the embryo's clock and the timing of events. So intrinsically, the genetics, the chromosomal status, the ploidy, the embryo's metabolism, there are patient factors, the BMI, there are publications to suggest that all of these things can affect the timing of embryo development. And of course, there are extrinsic factors. We know that different culture media have impact on the pace of embryo development, the gas tension, whether or not we're using reduced oxygen, and certainly the insemination method. We do IVF and ICSI, we have different average timings for the morphokinetic events. Now, this is quite a new chart. I've never shown this before. Don't think I've even shown it to my colleagues, but I'll share it with you guys. We've done a recent analysis of 27,000 two pronucleates. And we wanted to see the percentage of visible 2PNs between 14 and 20 hours. And this is plotted at 30-minute intervals. And what we're looking for is a sweet spot. So these are all ICSI, and we're trying to see if we only have one chance to look at look for fertilization in our standard practice, when should we do that? Should we do it at 17 hours plus or minus 1 hour? Because that's a 2-hour window, or should we be more precise? At least on this large data set, we see that with the KID positives, so these resulted in successful clinical implantation. With ICSI, I would say 16.25 hours is the time that you will capture most of the two pronucleates successfully and accurately. You can see there's not a single time point between 14 and 20 hours where you will catch 100% of fertilization events. So I think it just goes to show that without time-lapse, we are certainly missing some successful fertilizations. And I think that's really sad. So the method of insemination, with IVF embryos in our very large data set, we can say that they exhibited an average delay of 1.79 hours compared to ICSI. And this is at 2 p.m. fading, and it continues. So the mean times for 2 p.m. fading for ICSI embryos was just close to 24 hours, but with IVF, 25.5 hours. So it doesn't mean we need to check at 25 hours. It just means to say that there is a delay. And so we should not really schedule IVF and ICSI fertilization checks similarly. So it is time to update the Istanbul consensus, and it is time to make sure we check for fertilization in ICSI embryos earlier than we do for IVF. So here we have just some more data on what would we miss in terms of numbers if we did a standard single assessment of fertilization at 18 hours, which I think is pretty standard. So with ICSI embryos, it's obviously easier to look at the data because with IVF, our practice would be to denude and assess at the same time. So we're denuding around 17 hours with IVF embryos. So I'll focus the data and the presentation on the ICSI, it's more accurate. So 3.9% of ICSI 2PNs had faded at 18 hours. So we've got little chance of seeing them. They've gone, that's 1 in 25. If we were a little bit late with our fertilization check, which I don't think is uncommon, and it, you know, hands up, it's happened, of course, at Care Fertility too. 9.24% of ICSI 2PNs had faded, so 1 in 11. And what does it matter though? Are they viable, these ones that are fading early and we would miss them? Well, yes, it does matter. Without time lapse, so we can extrapolate the information. We've transferred 6,402 with known clinical outcome, and where the pronuclei had completely faded by 18 hours, we have an implantation rate, clinical heartbeat at 35% for ICSI and nearly 17% for IVF. So they are viable and they are worth seeking out. So time-lapse is enabling complete flexibility and enhanced accuracy of fertilization, as well as other embryo assessments. PGTA, I think, is an interesting one. As we know, the blastocyst is very dynamic, and we can use time-lapse to help with the PGTA program as well. So an early insemination, using the tactics of time-lapse, will allow us more culture time. So more time to get to the blastocyst by day 5, if that's when the biopsies are mostly performed. And this continuous monitoring of the embryo development blastocyst dynamics will allow us just to assess without any disruption which embryos are ready for biopsy or whether we should wait a little bit longer. So it allows this flexibility and stability of culture. And we can also have the facility to go for a remote access. So we could look into the viewer, to the images, to help decide if we need to send people in, if yesterday's blastocysts, day 5, are now ready on day 6, or if they're not suitable for blastocysts, for biopsy or vitrification. So there are lots of little tips and tricks that we can use to our benefit when we've got time-lapse at our fingertips. This one, I think, is just, it's quite anecdotal, but it's an interesting one. And Alex did say, we slip in a few little slides if you think they're interesting and they might not directly relate to workflow. But I think it's really nice for embryologists. We all know we've been sat at the ICSI rig for hours, struggling with a really difficult ICSI, doing our very best for the patient. And then we've got to go home and wait 18 hours to come back in to see whether they've fertilized. And what we found is, after only around 3 hours or so, we can see the second polar body extrude. So before we go home, we can have a look at the fruits of our labor and quite reliably assess whether or not the fertilization is taking place. So at least 95% reliability that the second polar body extrusion is going to translate to pronuclei the next day. So it certainly helps me sleep better. And I think that's just it's not necessarily you're going to ring the patient and reassure them, but maybe you would, but based on a 95% reliability, but it's certainly reassuring for the team and quite a nice little anecdote. Some more scientific data on second polar body extrusion. And this we find is quite a novel early indicator of embryo viability. We presented this data at Fertility 2018, one of the UK big conferences. And it was an in-house logistic regression study. And we found that the clinical pregnancy rates were significantly higher where the angle of the second polar body to the first extrusion was less than 45 degrees. So putting it simply, if your second polar body is extruded close to the first polar body, that's a really positive sign in terms of embryo viability. So in this study of almost 2,500 known implantation embryos, 37% clinical pregnancy rate when the polar bodies extruded side by side, or at least within 45 degrees, and 24% when they were further apart. So I think that's quite interesting and it's exciting. And this is the sort of thing that we imagine that AI would be detecting and introducing into those algorithms that we're waiting, hopefully, for. So which assessments, based on my experience, our experience as a large group, which assessments are most indicative of viability? So we've had almost 10 years of time-lapse experience alongside standard practice. So we still aren't 100% time-lapse. So we're still looking for the best in our time-lapse system, but also in our standard practice, and to take those lessons from the time-lapse learnings and put them into our standard practice. And quite recently, we've been questioning how valuable are these routine, timed and standard snapshot assessments. for our standard incubation patients, and whether we can streamline standard workflow based on the learnings from time-lapse. But it's not straightforward, because I think that there are at least 3 very important assessments after fertilization, which I've suggested is the most important. And based on our data and which parameters, which time-lapse variables are most indicative of viability, I'd say it's probably these 3. The multicotymus mitosis, this is Nikika's ducts, these direct cleavages from 1 to 3, really important. But we have very little chance of spotting this with without time-lapse. The next one I think is compaction, the morula. I think that has lots of secrets to hide, and an assessment of the morula can be really useful. And it's quite simply whether that compaction is complete or not. And again, without time-lapse, we have very little hope of assessing that with any great confidence and precision. And the third one is probably my favorite, and this has been with us right from the beginning, the very first model that we ever created, which was an aneuploidy risk classification model, is when does blastulation start? And it's always been, whenever we build a model, we go back to the whole data set, we have no preconceptions, but it always features. So the beginnings of blastulation are very important. And again, without time-lapse, we've struggled to see it. You might be lucky, but we need more than luck. So imagine the workflow. If I said to our embryologists, right, in standard incubation, we're going to have to try, these are very important variables, we need to try and spot them. It would be a disaster. It'd be impossible. So I just mentioned the morula a little bit more because I think it's an interesting one. So we did another logistic regression analysis looking at clinical pregnancy rates with based on the degree of compaction. And clinical pregnancy rates were significantly higher where there was no excluded material at compaction. And again, it's nearly 2,500 embryos. And this variable now features in our day 4 selection model. So we've done a lot of embryo transfers recently on day 4 in the afternoon, looking for the early signs of blastulation, and our pregnancy rates and live births are at least as good as our day 5 outcomes. And that in itself provides a huge amount of flexibility with workload and workflow. So we need to be creative in the interest of the patients and the teams, and try and extrapolate some of the lessons from time-lapse to standard practice. So we have recently introduced a please do not disturb practice with our standard patients. We love the fact that time-lapse gives continuous culture, no disturbances, and we believe that some of the benefits are undoubtedly related to that, as well as the selection improvements that we can make. And we question really whether the benefits of undisturbed culture are outweighing the benefits of these static daily assessments, particularly as we're learning that the timings aren't precise enough, and we could be missing things that really matter. So hopefully, maybe this time next year, we'll have more data to share with you on that, because standard practice is going to stay for some time. I think, unfortunately, not everyone can have time-lapse, but we can use the time-lapse to share our learnings with standard practice. So in conclusion, workflow is certainly, it's streamlined and it's flexible with time-lapse. And we can learn lessons and apply those to standard practice, which also will improve workflow across the whole clinic. And time-lapse allows the most reliable fertilization assessment and embryo assessments. And it avoids that rigidity of the manual static times and the clock watching, which may have variable value. It allows continuous monitoring and optimization in the PGTA program, so we can biopsy at the right time for our patients and to vitrify. And we can all learn from historical practice, each other's practice, and hopefully as many people as possible can benefit from all of this experience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Alison. Fantastic. Okay, we're well done. We're on track with the timing of all the presentation. We've got we are all the speakers. Thank you very much. We're spread across, I think, all 24 time zones at the moment. So it's very late for some, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Wait, let me just check if we've got any new questions. Yeah. Can I start by asking, a question for everybody, if they want to answer, is like, how do they see the future embryologist role with the development of this technology, in particular in terms of the AI as well associated with it? Okay, do you want to start first because you're on the end of the time zone for us?
Well, I would say that the embryologist work becomes easier. Not so much, fiddling of embryos. They can sit at the comfort of their office and do all these assessments, if they even have to do any assessments, because all of that could be automatic. So I think that would make embryologist life easier.
Anybody else?
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to add something. It's like, you know what? Embryologists at this point of time around the globe, unfortunately, not everyone, okay? But the majority became technicians that repeat techniques. And the embryologist needs to use their brain to improve what is happening, to think about those things that are happening in the embryos and improve it. But they don't have time now because they're becoming too busy. So I think technologies is not only going to have the possibility to standardize, automatize, and get precision embryology for them, but release some time for them to think and analyze things to improve for the future.
Anybody else would like to add to this? No? We have a question on micro PN. Alison, I don't know if you talked about the PN. Can you tell us a little bit about the frequency of the micro PN observations and your opinion and the recommendation with those?
Yeah, we haven't done a huge amount of study of them. We don't see them very often at all, but we just monitor them and we avoid transfer if we've got something else. So yeah, we've seen some strange behaviours, but they're pretty rare. We've seen micro-PN trail across the ooplasm into the polar body and come back as though it's going to try and self-correct. It's quite remarkable, but we don't fully understand it.
I have one question about automatic annotation. Is it available now? It doesn't say specifically to who. I mean, I know the short answer, it is available now. Anybody wants to add about on that question? I think
It is
Nikika,
available.
yeah, Nikika, I think you use it, and I think as well we talked about that technology as if it's available.
Yeah, It definitely is available.
Okay. I think it's a question for Niels. This one, it's what is the histogram on the screen on the embryoscope represent?
The histogram, I'm not quite sure I understand that, please.
I think it's the activity chart that it is by the embryo.
Oh, okay. That is an old story. It's simply looking at the total amount of movement of the embryo, and it's simply generates peaks at the time when there's a lot of differences in two consecutive images. And those often correlate with cell divisions, but they could also correlate with other things. So it's a good first estimate at when a cell division could occur, but you have to check it.
We have one question that just came in. What are the precautions should be taken while handling time-lapse during COVID times? I know in the UK, I don't know, Alison, if you've been with the ARC's recommendation of time-lapse for improved workflow and spacing of embryology. Do you want to answer this question?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, I think we are recommending more time lapse because it's less interventions, less traveling across the lab, less people in the lab, trying to enforce distancing. But some people don't have big space. Most people don't have big spacious labs. So our embryologists are masked. They've got their own pipettes. So we're trying to put in as many measures as we possibly can to keep them safe and the patients safe, and of course the embryos safe. And really the safest place for the embryos is in a time-lapse device.
Perfect. Okay, I think these are all the questions. I think there was a question asking if KidsCore is available on the original EmbryoScope. I think that's for Niels.
Yes, indeed it is.
Yeah.
Indeed it is. So it's independent of the system, and it's of course been tested with all the different time-lapse systems that we make to make sure it works everywhere.
Well, that's all the questions. Thank you very much, everyone. I don't know if Alex is still online, if he wants to say anything or not.
Yeah.
He's on the beat.
Nice. What is it? Bishampatam.
Different time zones indeed.
So thank you for the excellent deliberations on various aspects of TL technology systems and its utility in IVF clinics with regard to workflow. And our main emphasis of this webinar was to give an idea on how TL clinics with a huge workload functions. I'm sure that audience got an overview of the technology, industry-leading systems from the experts who is also in the field for more than a decade, having experience with TL technology. And I would like to thank each one of the speakers. And Alison, thank you for giving some tips for embryologists to make their day stress-free by using a TL workflow management. Thank you very much. And I know that there is, due to time differences in the regions, many people couldn't log in, especially from the eastern side of the globe. So we will be recording the thing, and we are going to put it in the social media, and we will be sending the video, the link to the registered participants. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very
you.
much for the
Thank you.
invitation.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.